It's going.
All right, awesome. So thanks for joining us at the Virtual Quant Marketing Seminar. Today, we're honored to have Garrett Johnson as our speaker, telling us about the effects of GDPR. Take it away.
Thanks, Andre. I'm honored to be asked to present. I want to begin by thanking the organizers, Ayelet, Dean, Raluca, my Andre, your Andre. You've put a lot of work into this and you've created a great platform for research in the field. And I want to tip my hat to you for how you've chosen to use that platform by focusing on early career scholars, by making space for people outside the field who are doing related work, and in particular for inviting many women in the field to present. It's a credit to all of you, and it makes me really proud to be part of our generations of scholars in marketing. So thank everybody that's here to hear a talk in July about the GDPR. I wish we could do this face-to-face, but it's good to be together. Today I'm going to talk about a paper that's joint work with Scott Shriver and Sam Goldberg. Scott's at Boulder, and Sam is a PhD student at Kellogg. We have a same set of co-authors. We have 2 GDPR papers together, and Sam should be on the job market in a couple of years. He's just an outstanding student and outstanding co-author. All right, so our main research question today is, can privacy policy hurt competition? And there is a theoretical tension between privacy and competition policy, but this claim lacks empirical evidence. So there's several reasons why we might expect there to be a tension. There, on the consumer side, one reason for this is consent. So the GDPR says that the firms need to list the data sharing partners for the consumer to consent. And you might expect that this incentivizes creating a list of few firms and of names that the consumer recognizes. And both of these factors would be anti-competitive. Now there's several firm reasons we might expect this to happen too. So a general concern with regulation is economies of scale. So larger firms may have more resources for compliance so that regulation becomes anti-competitive. But today we're going to talk about a novel mechanism, which is B2B choices of data vendors. So if a privacy regulation pushes firms to limit their data sharing, firms may prefer to keep their larger vendors because those vendors have better products. So quick overview for today's talk. We're going to talk about the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR. And this is a landmark privacy policy and a leading example to the world. We are going to use its May 25th, 2018 enforcement deadline as an event study. And the GDPR is very complex, but its many elements contribute to increasing both the logistical cost and legal risk associated with personal data processing. And this is going to have important consequences for the web. Now, we study the technology vendor industry that provides an ecosystem for the web to thrive. So specifically, these vendors help websites to monetize themselves with ads, to load and share content, as well as measure and optimize their site traffic. Now, in order to provide many of these services, vendors are often sharing what the GDPR considers to be personal data. And this industry has faced intense regulatory scrutiny, with at least 3 EU countries releasing major reports or statements criticizing the industry. But even to date, in July 2020, we have not seen any fines in this industry. So a quick overview of our main findings. We show that there's a reduction of 15% in vendor use post-GDPR, and we see an increase of 17% in vendor concentration post-GDPR. So our plan for today, I'm going to spend some time talking about the GDPR, and then discuss our data in some detail and briefly introduce our theory model. And our results are going to proceed in 3 stages. I'm going to talk about the GDPR's effect on vendors, its effect on market concentration, and also some differences by website. So beginning with the primer on the GDPR. The GDPR expands the definition of personal data to include all data that is unique pertains to a unique individual. So in particular, this is going to include cookie identifiers and IP addresses. And so that's why this industry is covered by the GDPR. So in particular, you shouldn't just be thinking about this as personally identifiable information like your name or email address. So as I mentioned, the enforcement is an event study. And the geographic scope you can see in the map here is it includes firms from within the EU, the 28 countries of the EU, which for a time period is going to include the UK. But it also actually includes non-EU firms that target EU residents, reasonably broadly defined. And the enforcement is also kind of interesting. The enforcement is split between a country level regulators and EU level regulators. And we're going to show that that leads to some important differences across countries. And finally, we're interested in studying this because it is like I said, a landmark privacy regulation. It affects the 28 countries of the EU, but it's also informed the development of many privacy regulations globally. So in particular, we have California's Consumer Protection Act, as well as privacy regulation in Brazil, Japan, and South Korea. Now, one of the GDPR's key principles is data minimization, and many elements of the law support that principle. So the regulation provides many rights to individuals, and these include the right to data access, the right to correct data, to erase data, and to take your data elsewhere, including taking your data to a competitor. And then on the firm side, there's many responsibilities. The first is rights-based responsibilities. So that means that you need to be able to respond to a consumer data access request or data erasure requests in a timely manner. And most of us are teaching in a business school, we understand that this is a pretty hard thing for firms to do. In many cases, firms do not have consumer databases that are able to speak to each other. So probably an important part of the cost of this regulation borne by the firms was being able to get their databases to speak to each other so they could actually satisfy this. Second, firms have to do a comprehensive data audit of how personal information is transmitted within their firms and used within their firms, which you can imagine for like a company like IBM or Facebook, this would be like a labyrinthian exercise.
Oh, looks like our speaker has frozen a bit. Hopefully he'll be back in a second, and maybe we'll also have him join via phone audio, which might make this a little bit. Just a second, hopefully Garrett will be right back. Sam, actually, just since you're here and maybe you know a little bit about GDPR as well, I thought I'd just ask, where is the line for companies that are basically doing business in the EU in some sense, or doing business potentially with EU citizens?
Yeah, you know, as with everything with the GDPR, I think often it's always a little gray. But I think in general, the interpretation that's taken these days is that if you are targeting EU customers, you need to comply with the GDPR. So if you are doing business with anyone who is living in the EU, a resident of the EU, you must comply with the GDPR.
There's some kinds of limits around the edges of, if I sell pizzas in Cincinnati and some German tourists come and buy my pizzas,
Right.
I maybe don't have to comply with GDPR?
Yeah, so you have to deliver the good or service to a resident in the EU, right? So if you're a German citizen in Ohio, it's not, you don't really need to comply, right? But I don't even, there's not been any sort of like prosecution, right? So it's actually, to some extent, it's not been, litigated. So we don't really know the answer in this context.
Yeah. Cool. Garrett, do we have you now on phone audio, or do we need to do something to?
Garrett, I think
There we go.
Yeah.
I was unmuted. Thank you
Okay.
for that. Lovely internet went down. Thank you, Comcast Infinity. If that goes down again, I might try their second thing. But I've tried to
We had fun getting I got some free legal consultations for my pizza parlor. So.
Well, that's always useful. I heard some of that. Anyways, I apologize for that. Oh, Murphy's Law. Anyways, I was explaining the different elements of the GDPR and pushing forwards. Now that my slide is locked. Hooray, goodness gracious. All right, so from the regulatory design literature, we know that from the regulator's perspective, if you want to get firms to comply with a law, you have two main levers to pull. The first is the fine that you issue, and the second is the probability of the fine. And in the GDPR, the fine is doing most of the work. So the fine is really high. It's up to 4% of global annual revenues. And I'll highlight that this is revenues from the firms globally rather than just from within the EU, which certainly makes it so that international firms are going to be paying attention to the GDPR and recognizes that much of the data processing is happening internationally. Second, the probability of a fine is probably actually pretty low because the regulators are under-resourced. And we've actually, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we haven't seen any fines in this industry. Now, that's not to say that everything is in compliance. In fact, 3 EU countries have criticized the industry for not being in compliance. So one element of this is the issue of consent, which the law says should be explicit opt-in and no pre-checked boxes. And the regulators have made it very clear that that's what should be applying in this specific instance of web technology vendors. But what we in fact see is an opt-out regime where websites put frictions and revoke consent. So have criticized, but it is nonetheless what's happened. And so one of the issues that we have in this paper is how should we evaluate a policy
Looks like we've lost Garrett again. I thought he was joining via phone audio as well.
I'm back again. I'm just gonna put on the phone so I have a.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
The one-click dialing information doesn't seem to be working.
Oh. You gotta press some numbers manually.
Yeah. Well, I switched internet connections, so maybe that improves things. And all right, you can see my screen?
Yep.
All right. So I don't know how much of this cut out. I'll just quickly say the last point, which is that we're trying to evaluate a policy that hasn't been enforced. And so we're going to evaluate it by looking at changes in firm behaviors that we're going to link to changes in firm beliefs about enforcement. So now would be a good time to pause and see if there's any questions about the GDPR before I push on with the data. Okay.
No questions now in the chat, so.
Awesome.
I do have
Thanks.
one very quick question if you have
Yeah.
a second. So it's a clarification question. To what extent can firms collect data on their own versus contract with different other vendors? I mean, I imagine they can switch away from vendors to collecting on their own, or does that, I just don't understand exactly how the industry works.
So I'll walk through. Essentially, the publisher is a gatekeeper because the publisher owns the relationship with the consumer. And so for information to be transmitted to the companies that the publisher is working with, the publisher needs to set up some code on their website to make that happen. But I'll walk through some examples that talk about that in a little bit more detail. Okay. So quick review of the literature. There's been a growing literature on economics looking at the impact of the GDPR. So this paper at the top by Jadjian and Wangman shows a 25% reduction in technology venture investment post-GDPR, which is pretty astonishing. I definitely recommend that you check out that paper. The same set of co-authors, we have another paper looking at about 1,000 different firms using Adobe data, showing that there's a reduction of over 10% in measured site traffic and revenue. The next two papers have an interesting flavor for marketing people because they have this flavor that, you know, marketing actually matters and personalized marketing matters. So the fourth paper in the list shows the impact of a permissioning campaign. And then the Guy Oridor and Tobias Saltz, who's with us today, paper, they have an interesting paper looking at the effect of consent for an online travel intermediary. And they show that opt-out rates are about 12.5%. And kind of the interesting thing that they do on top of that is they show that the people that don't provide their consent tend to be more privacy protective, and actually their data is less valuable. So it's a little bit easier for the firm to make predictions and to market to the remaining consumers that continue to provide consent. And then finally, there's this paper by Christian Pugert and co-authors that also shows that the GDPR increases concentration. So it's very complementary to ours. So I encourage you to check it out. They find a similar conclusion, taking a different path. So then this paper, as you're about to see, is actually quite aligned with a large literature in computer science showing basically doing this exercise of tracking the trackers and finding all the different companies that websites use and partner with to make their sites work. And this literature extends into the GDPR. But this literature tends not to really look at this as an economic decision. And I think that's one of our contributions in this paper, is to try to analyze these firm choices of which vendors to use as an economic decision. All right, so I'll push forward and talk about the data and briefly the theory. So when you visit your favorite website, your browser interacts with the first-party domain of that site. So in this case, interacting with theguardian.com. At the same time, your browser interacts with potentially dozens of third-party domains owned by vendors selected by the website to provide these services. So here you'll see some logos that you recognize, like Facebook and Twitter and Yahoo, that are all either being used for social sharing or for monetization, ad monetization. Now, the GDPR is hard to study because normally we cannot observe how firms use and share our personal data. But what's interesting here is that this function is being outsourced to the browser. And so we're actually able to observe the website's network of vendors. Now, our data collection proceeds as follows. We use a VPN service to simulate ourselves as coming from within the EU, specifically from France. And we use a piece of software developed by Tim Liebert, who's a researcher at CMU. And this allows us to record all the third-party domain interactions that happen when we visit a website through various means. And we're going to repeat this for 28,000 top websites regularly in 2018. And specifically, the websites in our sample are the top 2,000 websites in each of the 28 EU countries, as well as the US, Canada, and globally. Now, I want to come back to Raluca's question and tell you a little bit more about how this works. So in this first example, I'm going to show you personal data that's being processed using a first-party and a third-party cookie. So first we have The Guardian, which installs a cookie on our browser. And because we were visiting The Guardian, this is the first-party cookie. And so this has a user ID, which is ABC123, which is considered personal information under the GDPR. But this is going to be useful to The Guardian so that The Guardian can know that we're logged in and that we have access to all the content. Now, in this example, The Guardian has selected Google as an ad vendor to monetize its website. And so it allows Google to interact with the user. And to do this, the website writes some code that tells the user's browser to interact with doubleclick.net. The browser visits doubleclick.net and gets a third-party cookie if it doesn't already have one. And note that the user ID here is different. It's EFG456. And this is for two reasons. The first is that doubleclick.net cannot read the first-party cookie. And second, doubleclick.net may have placed a cookie on the browser at another website, like Macy's.com, which is going to allow Macy's to retarget the user when they arrive at The Guardian. Now, in the second example, I'll show you that it's possible to transmit personal information without using a third-party cookie. So this is actually how Google Analytics works. If The Guardian decides to work with Google Analytics, and then they're going to install some code, some JavaScript code on their website that tells their user's browser to interact with GoogleAnalytics.com. And the way this is going to take shape is they're going to use a very long URL at GoogleAnalytics.com that's going to include a lot of information, including this first-party ID, which is ABC123. So in this way, Google Analytics is going to be able to count the number of unique visitors that visit theguardian.com. And then finally, this third example is it possible to have an interaction with a third-party domain that does not contain personal information. So here, The Guardian is using fonts.com to load some fonts on its website. And the fonts.com domain is sending the font information to the browser, but they're not sending any user ID. So in this case, this would not be covered by the GDPR. If there's no questions, then I'll tell you a little bit of some descriptive statistics. So on average, we see that there's 16.3 third-party domains prior to the GDPR and 14.4 vendors. Now, the reason for this distinction is that some vendors may use multiple third-party domains. So Google may use doubleclick.net and doubleclick.com, for instance. We're just going to count them as one. About a little under half of these are using third-party cookies, but 92% of websites on average are using first-party cookies. We are able to categorize many of these vendors. So we categorize a little over half of the vendors, 8.4 of those, using this database developed by the same researcher, Tim Liebert. And in terms of the Alexa rank, we see we've got the #1 site by construction, which I think is google.com, all the way down to site ranked in the 6 millionth website according to Alexa. And that's what happens when you include the top 2,000 websites from Lithuania. You're going to get some very long tail websites. And then finally, the share of EU users on average is 70%. But by construction, the sample is tilted highly towards EU users, websites with a large share of EU users. So the median is 89.9. And we've got still the whole range of 0 to 100 in our data. All right, to give you a sense of what these look like by categories, again, using this database from Tim Liebert, about half of the categorized domains or vendors are using monetizing the website. So this includes Google and DSPs and SSPs and ad exchanges. Then we have the second largest category, which is a pretty wide umbrella. It includes web hosts like Amazon Web Services, various code that websites will use like Google APIs, and JavaScript, video serving using YouTube or Vimeo, and things like fonts from Typekit or fonts.com. The third category is audience measurement. So this includes Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics. And social media are all kind of names that you would recognize. And this is for social sharing of content principally. And then design optimization is very similar to audience measurement, but it has some more advanced capabilities like the ability to do A/B testing on a website from a vendor like Optimizely. Now, the remaining categories are really small. So security is for protecting your site from bot attacks. Native ads is just a very specific form of advertising. CRM is on-site messaging widgets. And then privacy compliance is the presence of a couple key privacy companies. So I will quickly outline the model. I'm not going to go into the math today, but in order to guide our empirical analysis, we wanted to use an equilibrium model of the web technology industry. And on one side of this market, we have differentiated vendors with asymmetric costs. And on the other side of the market, we have a representative website that's trying to choose vendors in order to improve its revenue. Now, as I explained before, the way that the GDPR is going to enter into this is that we add a fine to this model that we're more or less taking off the shelf. And the fine amount is 4% of global revenues. And then the probability of the fine is going to correspond to sites' beliefs about enforcement. The model's key comparative statics then are that as the website's beliefs about enforcement increase, we should see fewer vendors in equilibrium. We should see an increase in concentration in the vendor market, and we should see that the high revenue sites cut vendors the most. So what I'm going to do is I'll defer the intuition for these results to the empirical results discussion, where I'll explain them in more detail. So this would be a good time to pause and see if there's some questions.
Yeah,
Garrett? Oh, go ahead.
No, Paul, please go ahead.
Garrett, can you give us an idea? So there's obviously a lot of different tracking scripts that are on these various websites. How many do these websites actually actively use these services, or do you have any idea how many of these are legacy scripts or those sort of things? Or I guess what I'm wondering is, are these all services and vendors that the publisher is actively using, or is it just an indication of a service or vendor that they used at some point in time?
So what Paul's referring to is that there can be some backdoors that vendors can sneak themselves into. So in particular, advertising has some of this, where within the iframe of the ads, some vendors may be able to load. And at least in the past, it was more possible for that to happen without the vendor's consent or knowledge. Here I'm expecting that most of this is a deliberate decision of the vendors. Like, most of these things are things that the website has had to write code into their website with vendors that they're partner with and are paying them for to make this happen. But we're still going to see differences, and we are focusing on differences in the average vendor use over time, and those I think are still, you're going to see what I hope is a pretty clear effect of the GDPR. But it's a good question, because it's also one that's hard to really talk about empirically.
Do you have anything on, so you mentioned that some of these are paid scripts, right? There are a lot of free providers out there, right? Google Analytics is a key example there of a service that is just free to maintain. And you can envision a scenario where there's a cost to put the script in, but there's also a cost to removing the script, right? Somebody actually has to go through the code, make sure they remove the script, only the part that works, those sort of things. So do you have visibility to which of these scripts are paid for and applying sort of what we would commonly think of as a vendor relationship?
No. One challenge we have empirically is we don't observe any money changing hands, either on the revenue side or the cost side when it comes to these vendors. So we're purely going to look at the vendor network ties. Now, for many of these sites, because we've selected 20,000 top websites, many of them are large enough that they are going to have to be paying some of these companies like Google Analytics for their services. But obviously we've got some long tail sites that may still be able to take advantage of the free offerings.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
I think my question goes in the same direction. So I was wondering whether you'll be able to tell apart in your data whether the drop, let's say, of a vendor was vendor initiated or website initiated. And the reason I'm asking is I'm wondering, and maybe I should know the answer myself, but to what extent sort of the liability is shared. So, you know, because you consent on the publisher's website, if the vendor somehow is not in compliance with GDPR, how that burden is legally shared between first and third party, and you know, one way to perhaps see whether there are vendors that initiate this is to, you know, you might see one vendor disappear on all the websites at once, and so then perhaps that would be an indication that it was not the website but the vendor itself.
Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, I'll show you in a couple slides some evidence of that. So I'll show you here that there's a significant reduction in the number of vendors that websites are using, and then I'll show you in the next slide that there's almost no vendors that are exiting the market. Because yeah, that's something that we're concerned about as well. In terms of liability, I think it's a situation that's a joint liability situation where the publishers are supposed to be liable for getting consent, and then the vendors should be jointly liable for how this information is being used if they're getting personal information. So they're very much working in concert. Excuse me. So
yeah, Garrett, there is two questions in Q&A. One is from GP about beliefs in the model. So like, what does it mean to have a equilibrium model in which beliefs are treated as exogenous?
So yeah, it's an interesting question. So the model like endogenizes prices and endogenizes the relationship between the two sides of the marketplace, but it treats the beliefs about enforcement as exogenous. And, you know, a major reason for that is that we don't have variation in actual, we don't actually see enforcement behavior by the regulator in this industry. So there's kind of no like intertemporal, well, we can't use any data from that to provide information that would inform those beliefs. But what I'll show you is that there's some other information we can use. So one thing we find is that like differences, there appears to be important differences in countries in how they respond to the GDPR, and in particular, countries that face what you might expect are stricter regulations tend to behave as though they're more afraid of the regulator. So that's, you know, one of the moments I'm going to show you that provides some evidence that this is happening. And the other thing I'm going to show is, you know, here on this figure, we see a stark reduction in the number of vendors that they're using, and then this gradual increase afterwards. And I'm going to show you some evidence that this is partially due to beliefs. But that's a good question. It's challenging to endogenize, and we don't have much more than what I've just said empirically to tie it to on the regulator side. So let me go ahead.
That's very quickly. Then the second question is about heterogeneity of the effect by sectors. For example, would we expect effect to be bigger in Internet of Things, where there is more sensitivity to privacy and higher consumer concerns?
Yeah, in principle, you would expect that those both, especially when it comes to health data, that some sectors are more liable than others and some just may be more sensitive. Obviously, we're just going to focus on websites and vendors. So one thing we can do is we can split the sample between vendors that are likely using personal data, and that's and certainly advertising, and I'll show you in a bit, that's where we see most of the movement.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks everyone for the questions. All right, so just proceeding with our results for vendor use, we see that the number of vendors prior to the GDPR is 14.4 on average. And then 1 week later, this falls to 12.4 vendors on average. So this is a 15% reduction, which we're going to refer to as the short run effect of the GDPR. Now, obviously, we would have preferred to collect at a longer pre-period, but we know from auxiliary data and from related research that the pre-trend is flat. Furthermore, you'll note that websites did appear to wait until the last minute to make changes to their website, which is why actually 3/4 of this drop is happening within a matter of a few days of the enforcement deadline. But it's still, because we grabbed data relatively late, we're probably understating the short run effects of the GDPR. But this reduction is short-lived, and you see that it gradually increasing until it's basically erodes the entire reduction in vendor use by the end of 2018. You have to keep in mind this is a very dynamic marketplace, and it's typically growing over time. Vendor use is typically growing over time. But we think that a part of the story is sites' beliefs about enforcement falling in response to a total lack of enforcement in the law, even up to date. And I already actually mentioned ahead of time some of the evidence I'm going to show you for that, but I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. So what's happening here? We think that this reflects websites making deliberate choices about web technology vendors, and we want to rule out some alternative explanations. So a question already came up about vendors exiting, and we see that the largest vendor that fully exit the market is only on 78 websites, which is a very small fraction of our sites. One thing in May 2018 that was very vivid for a lot of people is that there were various websites that were blocking EU users, and that turns out to be not really a factor in our data as well. It turns out that we were able to find a database of 1,300 websites that were blocking EU users, but only 13 of those were in our list of top 28,000 websites. We found an additional 28 sites that were blocking EU users just by manually inspecting them. But a kind of funny thing is that only a quarter of these, so 10 out of 42 blocking sites, were materially reducing their third-party domain use, so reducing it below 10. So effectively, many of these sites appeared as though they were blocking EU users, but were actually still pinging these third parties and in some cases transmitting personal information. Now, finally, there's this role of consent, and if websites were waiting to get consent before interacting with these third-party domains, that would certainly affect our data. That doesn't seem to be what's happening, so we were able to identify about 10% of our websites that are using an external privacy extension to get consent, but on these set of sites, we found no change in sites that were loading 0 third-party domains. This is also supported by some research in the computer science literature that shows that the vast majority of websites are setting at least one identifier cookie without waiting for consent from the user. Any questions on this?
Is that not a problem for your setup where everything is based on the probability of enforcement relative to their violations? I think point 3 is basically saying that almost everyone was still just actively violating the law. Is the fine differential by how badly you violated? Is it like a speeding ticket in that way? Or was it just days of violation relative to fine? Or because you said it was 3% of global revenue, right?
4%, yeah.
4%.
Well, again, there haven't been any fines here, and the regulators have basically been slow playing this industry. But so we don't know. I mean, we can sort of make assumptions about, as you say, speeding being worse. So our model just basically assumes that there's some probability of enforcement, and it kind of operates like a tax. In the past, we were using a model that just focused on the publisher side that was allowing that probability to vary with the number of vendors. I find that very intuitive, that the more vendors that you're using or the more data, personal data that you're sharing, the more you'd increase the chance of getting fined. But we're able to generate the same essential set of results without making that assumption. But yeah, it's a good question that nobody really knows the answer to, but we can make informed guesses, I guess.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Garrett. So I understand that sites are not blocking EU users, but I'm wondering whether the site's vendor choice is user specific, in the sense that the global site might be just like disabling behavior ad targeting, or a vendor feature if the user is coming from the EU countries or from California region, while keeping the vendor service the same for other users. I'm thinking this might be more so if the EU users comprise like small percentage revenue share for that site, because it might be easier to just disable that particular vendor feature for a specific user. Then disconnecting the contract with the vendor altogether. The data that you just mentioned seems to be collected by creating a French user. So this might be a problem if you are comparing the global website versus the EU website. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'll show you near the end of the talk some, I think, some pretty compelling differences in how websites are treating users depending on what share of traffic they're getting from the EU. In the paper, we also have one data pull from about 3 months after the GDPR, where we looked at the data from the perspective of a US user as well as a French user. And there you see a really interesting differences where there's actually a pretty small gap between how EU websites are treating both types of users. There's a massive gap of how US users are treated versus EU users are treated on websites that have a small share of traffic from the EU. So there's, yeah, definitely websites are making decisions about how to treat users and which vendors to load depending on whether they're coming from the EU. Cool, so no, thank you for the question. I'm gonna push forward because I'm a little short on time. So, and talk to you about the second implication of our model, which is on concentration for the vendor market. So here to fix ideas, we know that vendor use is falling post-GDPR, and actually most vendors are worse off post-GDPR. They're losing market share. So instead what we're gonna ask is, do the large vendors get a larger share of the smaller pie? So our results are gonna be exclusive to market structure, and we're not gonna have anything to say about market conduct. As I mentioned before, we're not observing pricing. So in order to measure this, we need to define market shares, and the basis of our market share definition is reach. So reach is the number of websites that are using a vendor. So in the sidebar example, Google Analytics has a reach of 2, and Adobe Analytics has a reach of 1 site. And in order to create the relative market shares, we're going to divide their own reach by the total reach, so that in this example, Google Analytics has 2/3 market share, and Adobe Analytics has 1/3 market share. The HHI then is just the sum of squared market shares, which is going to go between a perfectly competitive market at 0 points all the way up to 10,000 points for a monopolist. And again, we aren't observing prices, we're just observing these vendor links, and so that's how we're going to construct these market shares. And the HHI is actually invariant if everybody falls by the same percentage, so this is going to, again, capture this intuition of capturing a larger share of a smaller pie. So finally, it's worth considering a little bit more complicated case where site B is now using Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics. Then each of these vendors is going to have, a reach of 2, and they're going to have a market share of 1/2. And that's basically something we're going to have to do to make market shares sum to 1. Though it's a little bit confusing because here, Google Analytics has 2/3 of the market, but in a relative sense, they only have 1/2. And same with Adobe. All right, so now we plot the relative HHI over 2018, and we see that the evolution of HHI is the mirror image of the average number of vendors. In particular, concentration rises 17% in the short run, and we think that this short run is informative, certainly directionally so, because again, we're trying to evaluate this policy that hasn't been enforced, and we think that the moment where beliefs about enforcement is higher provides some a useful indication. And again, I'll come back to the beliefs at the end of the talk. And this validates our second model prediction that the GDPR increases concentration. Our model attributes this to asymmetric costs between vendors, so that websites drop high-cost vendors which have smaller market shares to begin with. In other words, vendors with large shares have large shares because they provide greater value. So websites prefer to retain the large vendors when the GDPR pushes websites to reduce data sharing. So on the last slide was showing you changes in aggregate HHI, but we want to define markets more narrowly. And we do so using this external categorization I mentioned before. And we see that advertising, which is the largest category, it's a little over half, sees an increase in concentration of 25.3%. So it's a very important contributor to this. And then the next three categories increase concentration between 2 and 6%. So these four categories combined represent 94.3% of vendors. And then the picture is a little bit more mixed afterwards, but the share of the market's collective vendors is very small, and some of these markets are already extremely concentrated because they have very few vendors in them. So quick couple words about robustness. So we show this also for concentration ratios, which may be more intuitive because it's just the sum of the total market shares of the top firms. We also show this for a novel metric, which we call head-to-head competition. And here we just say, if you use a dominant vendor and a competitor before the GDPR, and you only retain one of them post-GDPR, how often do you retain the dominant vendor? And this is a very clear indicator of what's happening in the market. So here in the advertising category, Google is winning 99% of these battles. In audience measurement, Google is winning 93.5% of these battles. And in social media, Facebook is winning 87% of these battles. So this is a big explanation for what's happening here. And finally, we're able to look at a second categorization, and our results are broadly robust to that as well. Any questions on that before I talk about some extensions?
To what extent is this effect driven by Google? I mean, I see the Facebook number there as well, but this largely seems to be the advertising domain, and Google is, you know, more than the 800-pound gorilla in that domain. To what extent is this Google, and to what extent is this a trend towards market concentration? For example, your head-to-head ratio, if you remove Google from that and look at head-to-head ratios among everybody else, do you get a similar effect, or do you get something much less than that?
I'll show you in a few slides that this is highly driven by Google. I don't remember the head-to-head results after Google off the top of my head. It's been a while, but I think it's a little less clear because some of these firms are, you know, quite a lot smaller than this gorilla, as you say, and so there's a little less differentiation. It's worth looking back into that.
Okay.
Garrett, another quick thing. How much of this is driven by firms which go, let's say, from 10 to 9 vendors versus from 2 to 1? So how long is the tail of firms which have a lot of vendors? And I think the way you compute market shares, they'll be treated in the same way. Like each count like.
So, you know, some of these categories, you're like, for audience measurement, you're almost always just using 1, maybe 2. And for advertising, you're conditional on using advertising. I think you're using 10 or more. And advertising is arguably more sensitive to the GDPR. So, and that's why we see, not here, but a few slides back, a reduction of 25% in the number of advertising vendors. So, you know, one of the challenges in this paper is these things are apples and oranges. And so we're trying to break them apart, and we're trying to think a little bit more with our model, how we can simplify this in terms of to what extent these vendor categories are important for monetization, and to what extent there's good substitutes available. So we have some more to do to push on that, but that's, you know, part of the significant variation within these categories that's underneath this top line figure.
One more question on the vendors that are being dropped. Have you ever checked which are the vendors that are, you know, initially being dropped and then re-added to the website, and whether there's any interesting sort of pattern that jumps out of that? The reason I'm asking, you know, you could envision that instead of you know, all of them responding to perceived enforcement probabilities, some of them just need time to get in compliance in some form. So I'm wondering whether there's any way to kind of get at that.
Yeah, so we haven't looked into this recently. You know, the question is, once this goes back, are you bringing back the same vendors? And it turns out that, like, of this pile that's dropped here, actually only 1/3 of those come back here. So 2/3 of these are new vendors. And there seems to be a lot of changing and kind of turnover in these vendors over time. It's also not really a story of entry or exit either. So we went and looked at this, and the entry and exit is on the order of basically 2% each. So they kind of offset each other. And the largest entrant, I think, is on like 300 or 400 websites. So it's really not driving these findings. In terms of compliance, it's a good question. There's a lot of uncertainty here, which is, you know, why we're emphasizing this, because there's a lot of signal here, but there's a larger pattern that seems to persist. In the end, you know, this industry's in this weird equilibrium of maintaining the status quo in the face of being told by the regulator that they're not compliant. So exactly what form compliance takes is, you know, probably not making too many changes, possibly making changes to your contracts, coming into compliance using the interagency IAB transparency and consent framework to fall under, to be connected into that. But, you know, some of this drop is actually, you know, websites are dropping Google Analytics for like a week and then bringing it back to some extent. So it is fairly across the board where we're seeing this. But yeah, it's good questions. When we've been digging into. All right, so I wanted to quickly discuss 3 extensions that explain a little bit more the mechanism of this finding, one that actually Paul has anticipated. But first, I want to talk about the role of personal data, which I think has also come up a bit before. So we're going to split the vendors between those that likely use personal data versus those that don't. So we're going to say, if you're using a cookie in the pre-period, then that's an indication that you're transmitting personal data. And as I showed you in the example of Google Analytics, it's possible to transmit information without using a cookie. So I'm also going to roll in the categories of audience measurement and site optimization that basically require personal data to do their jobs. And so here we see the concentration is 19.3% among those that likely use personal data, but only 5.6% among those that don't. So this means that we see a larger concentration effect precisely on the vendors that are targeted by the GDPR. But it also means that the pool of personal information is becoming more concentrated post-GDPR. And this is important because we think that personal information may act as a sort of moat for companies, a competitive moat, which makes entering the marketplace more difficult. And so this effect would actually reinforce the anti-competitive effect of the GDPR potentially. Now, the second thing we looked at is the role of consent, because I said at the beginning of the talk that we may expect that the GDPR pushes websites to provide a list of few vendors and vendors that consumers recognize. And so we split the sites between those that use a consent platform and don't, and we don't really see any difference in concentration here. But we think this is just basically because in practice, websites were bearing their list of vendors several clicks into the consent dialog windows. So there wasn't really an opportunity for this mechanism to kick in. And finally, getting to Paul's question, we were really interested in the role of these top 2 companies. And I showed you before that when we include all the companies, including Google and Facebook, we see this increase of 17.3%. But when we remove all the vendors associated with these 2, we actually see a reduction in concentration. So these 2 are playing a really key role in this finding. And so one way of summarizing that is that the old adage that nobody gets fired for choosing IBM should be updated to include Google and Facebook. Any quick questions about those extensions before I wrap up with my last set of results?
Garrett, there was 2 quick questions in the chat. Maybe you can do them now. One is about what kind of vendors you considered from Heather. So I'll just read it out loud. Did you look at integration of CRM and social? There were several GMPs players that sit in the middle to do retargeting. And there is few large CRMs which do both GMP, like 7 Oracle. Or does it consider all like things like Facebook Pixel?
I didn't catch all of that, but like I think the question was a little bit about, you know, breaking apart some of these categories like advertising into subcategories. That's something we're going to do a little bit of work on, but it's actually pretty difficult because we only see the domain information, and many of these firms are integrated. So in particular, if Google's involved, we can't tell if Google's being used as an SSP or an exchange or a DSP when it's in the marketplace. So the lines are going to be pretty blurry here. And as we just saw here, you know, Google really is the gorilla that's helping to drive these results. So, you know, we're going to try to get a better sense of what's going on in that regard, but it's pretty hard.
Thanks. And the second question from Sylvia, how to think about the magnitudes of results HHI seem relatively low?
Well, the reason why it's low is this, you know, fact that we need to make market shares add up to 1, and these websites are using 16 of these vendors on average beforehand. So it's just going to artificially depress the vendor shares. So, you know, I think of this as largely directional. I think that this fact that this is basically the mirror image of the previous thing shows you that there's a there, and this is a question we've been trying to get empirical evidence on for some time, and hopefully this provides is convincing for some of you.
Thanks.
All right, so push forward with the last set of results, and I can go somewhat quickly here. So what we're going to do is explain some differences by website that provide some interesting economics of what's happening here. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to break apart sites by the short run drop by various characteristics. And an example of this is I'm going to split sites by the share of traffic they get from the EU. And we see that sites that get 90 to 100% of their traffic from the EU drop by a little over 2 vendors. Whereas sites that are getting between 0 to 100% of their 0 to 10% of their traffic from the EU drop by twice as much, so a little over 5 vendors on average in the short run. So we think that this reflects the incentives of the GDPR that place a 4% penalty on global revenue. This means that sites with few EU users have relatively little to gain in terms of revenue from the EU, but relatively more to lose from a penalty on their global revenue. The GDPR incentive then has this perverse effect that the sites with the greatest share of EU users do the least to cut vendors. Finally, notice also this discontinuity for sites with 0% of users from the EU. Many of these sites are not targeting EU users, so they're not actually subject to the GDPR, and therefore they don't need to be making changes. So here, we're just going to see these same results in regression form, where I'm interacting the short run effect of GDPR with various site characteristics. And with more covariates, we see that we replicate this result for a share of EU users and this discontinuity for sites without EU users. But we also look at site characteristics. So our model tells us that sites with the greatest revenues should cut vendors the most. And the model intuition here is that the higher revenue sites will find it optimal to engage more marginal vendors. And so these sites will make deeper cuts in response to the GDPR. So in particular, we use 3 proxies for this. We use site traffic, which is the inverse of site rank, the number of ads on a page, as well as a measure of the users per capita income. And in each case, these revenue shifters are associated with deeper cuts to vendors in the short run. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this growth of vendors post-GDPR and look at how this evolves by firm characteristics. So one thing we noticed is that after the GDPR, the average number of vendors grew quite slowly in countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, but grew rapidly in countries like Bulgaria and Poland. Now, the GDPR was supposed to harmonize regulation within the EU, but it is still enforced in part at the country level. So we found a survey measure from the EU that measures regulatory strictness and is specific to data protection. And we found that this is negatively correlated with the post-GDPR growth in vendor use. So in the next slide, we're going to interact this linear growth with characteristics, much like we've done here. And I know I've got 1 minute, but I'm going to take 3 minutes. So please bear with me. So as we showed on the last slide, the interaction with regulatory strictness is negative. And getting back to this question of beliefs, we think that beliefs about enforcement are falling over time, which means that the interactions with revenue shifters should have the opposite sign as they did in the short run. Now, the sign on user income is counter to our expectations, but we think that just arises from a correlation between user income and user demand for privacy. However, we do show that the interaction with site traffic and ad count have the expected sign. So with this and the cross-country differences, we conclude that website beliefs about enforcement played an important role in explaining the evolution of this industry in 2018. All right, so just wrapping up then, we started out with a theoretical tension between privacy and competition policy, and today we're able to show you the first empirical evidence of this tension. The GDPR had its intended consequence, which was to reduce web technology vendor use and its associated data sharing, but it had several unintended consequences. We saw that it increased the market concentration, and in particular increased the concentration of personal data. We found that sites with the most visitors from the EU actually do the least to reduce these vendors, which seems to be a perverse side effect of the GDPR penalty design. And finally, we saw that beliefs about local enforcement persist despite the GDPR's intended role of reducing, of harmonizing regulation throughout EU. And finally, we got some sense of what drives this concentration mechanism. It's principally a Google and Facebook effect. It's principally restricted to firms that are, or vendors that are using personal data, but user consent does not seem to be playing a key role. So thank you for letting me go 1 minute over, and thank you for bearing with me with the technology glitches. But there's some really great questions and feedback, and I look forward to the conversation continuing.
Thanks a lot, Garrett. We have a couple of more questions, but I think at this point we'll just conclude, we're out of time, so we'll conclude the seminar. But please stick around with us to have more discussion offline afterwards. Garrett, I have several, we can start from the questions in the Q&A. There was several of them. So the first one is, the goal of the policy was mainly helping consumers, perhaps increasing consumer surplus. How should we think about the relationship between concentration in vendors and consumer surplus?
Well, you have to ask the hard question. I think that's one challenge in general in studying privacy, is that it's very hard to get reliable signals from consumers, and so very hard to get to do the welfare analysis on the consumer side. I'm not sure. I mean, you know, one irony of the GDPR is that after all this hoopla about increasing privacy of consumers in the EU, my sense is that the survey evidence of EU's perception of their privacy is pretty much unmoved, which is not what you'd want to see. I mean, but maybe some of this is just because one of the salient instances of privacy protection is navigating the internet. And as we've seen, there's not a huge increase in consumers' ability to avoid some of the privacy sharing, data sharing online, but there is a pretty significant increase in these consent monologues that show up every time, consent dialogues, pardon me, that show up every time a user visits a website in the EU.
There were more questions in the chat, but I wonder if maybe it's easier to add people and just ask directly. We have Brett, I think. Brett, you want to ask a question? We also have Venki.
Brett, can you unmute? Or Venki?
Hi. Thank
Hi,
you
Venki.
for, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for taking my question. First of all, Garrett, great presentation, wonderful work. I love the theory and empirics both together. My question is about, apparently, I may be wrong here, analysis doesn't control for the actions or the strategic moves of the players, particularly Google and Facebook. Do you notice them making any moves to make it harder for other parties to comply with the GDPR, or maybe trying to acquire some of them? Are there any moves that could explain why the concentration goes up initially and then later on, you know, people get used to the new normal?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, some of what we're trying to argue is that they don't really have to do anything if the regulation is putting pressure on websites to reduce vendors. You know, if they have a better value proposition, so in Google's case, they just have larger pockets in terms of the ad monetization value they can deliver, then vendors are just going to endogenously choose them. It's a good question about what's going on in the background here. So the EU regulator, sorry, the UK regulator, competition regulator, criticized Google for waiting till the last minute to make its contracting and decisions known when it came to vendors and ad technology. And so that puts some pressure to either go with Google exclusively or to go with a broad set of vendors for advertising. And so that's part of the story there. I have not heard anything about Facebook, so it's not really clear to me what the story is for Facebook, the effect with Facebook.
Thank you.
It's a good question. Thank you. JP?
Yes. First, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Just making sure. Okay, very good. First, that was a really interesting talk, so thanks for that. I actually had a question, but I first want to comment on that consumer surplus point earlier.
Great.
I think it'd be really helpful if in your paper, and maybe this is already available elsewhere, but have a little conversation about exactly what GDPR is for. I don't recall GDPR being based on a consumer surplus enhancing initiative, unlike, say, antitrust laws. I always thought GDPR was more about ethical use of personal information. I don't see any reason why GDPR might reduce consumer surplus. If there are certain types of personal data that a firm could target on, but it's considered unfair or unethical to use that, eliminating that targeting could reduce consumer surplus. You know, it's like in pricing, for example, this could end up with a uniform price that for the majority ends up being higher than what would have been the targeted price. In advertising, it might mean not allowing the dissemination of communications that would have been helpful. So I don't think that, I mean, again, you don't need to answer this now, but I'd love to read a little discussion for marketers about what GDPR was really meant to do and how that relates back to the kind of surplus related goals that economists think about. I think my actual question for you is a little bit
Could I just quickly respond to that, JP, before I get
yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's something we can think about a bit more. I think of it less as a kind of price discrimination story or offer discrimination. I think of it more as like this personal information, specifically with advertising, really helps websites monetize on the order of doubling the revenue they get when they're able to use a cookie, which has been shown by my research and other people's research. And so, you know, honestly, I think what's happening here is that the regulators are deliberately slow playing this industry because they realize that if they totally enforce consent rates would go from 90% down to 10%. And it would totally sewer the ability of these websites to monetize, which would have huge impacts on consumer surplus. So that's, you know, another way to back into it. But it is a really good point. I'm interested to hear your question.
Yeah, I'd love to read that discussion if you ever wrote it. You'd probably be one of the best people to write it in the field, so I'd definitely read that very happily. My other comment's kind of related. It has to do with the supply side and the unintended consequences of increased concentration amongst some of these big entrenched vendors. And I just wonder, is there any reason not to think that there are very large fixed and sunk costs to developing the capabilities of ethical and appropriate personal data use at scale, and that this might actually be a natural oligopoly, and that the concentration increases might actually be efficient in some sense?
That's interesting. Let me try to answer that. So I think, you know, right now this industry is really holding on to the status quo. So I don't think that that's necessarily what's going on right now, but I think that that's very key to what's happening in the future. So right now, you know, several browsers have unilaterally killed third-party cookies, which has pretty much killed a lot of this, including our ability to monitor it for research. But Google has taken it upon themselves to try to create a privacy-safe version of advertising technology. And it really does go to what you're talking about, which is that they have the resources to do it, number one. And number two, they have the ability, because of their size, to coordinate a marketplace around that. And this is, you know, maybe a good thing for privacy. It's certainly what the regulators in the EU are pushing for, but it is disconcerting from the perspective of competition because Google is going to in-house even more of this advertising technology marketplace and potentially the dollars that go through there. So it's you know, it's a double-edged sword, and that's, I think, what we're trying to say with this paper is that it's not just so simple as privacy is a good thing and there's no trade-offs.
Thanks.
I have a question that goes in exactly the same direction. And so let me also first compliment your paper. I think it's really important because it goes exactly to the heart of the question of, you know, how should smaller advertising companies compete with these large conglomerates? In the pre-GDPR world, they needed this third-party access, and from a regulatory point of view, how can privacy be maintained while still, having competition in the marketplace? I'm wondering whether you have, and that's not a question strictly related to your paper, but more sort of broadly thinking, do you have any ideas of how could we, design such regulation while still maintaining competition and giving other companies access to data that they need to be on equal footing with Google? So that's probably not an easy, there's no easy answer. Sort of wondering whether you have any ideas.
Oh, yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I think one of the parts of the GDPR is this right to port your data over to somebody else. I think that was supposed to help some of this and supposed to help competition, but in reality, the very few consumers are going to take the time to do that, and it's non-trivial cost for the firms to ingest the data from their competitors too. So I don't know. I mean, the simple answer is to try to find firms, to make the size of the firms part of the objective function from the regulators. So to try to disproportionately go after the big guys, which is probably what's already happening. There's, Google and Facebook have already received, well, certainly Google has received fines. I'm not sure if Facebook received fines from the GDPR or from other things, but that could be part of the story. I don't know. It seems hard because I mean, part of what you and JP's questions get at is that, here I'm talking about B2B vendor choice just in terms of quality. Like you're going to want to choose to keep the larger firms if they've got better value. But there's another dimension, which is that the larger firms may have a superior ability to comply with the regulation, and that could cause you to pick them. And these just strike me as fundamental market forces that it's hard to design around, but it's a really good question.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought Toby was asking something slightly different. Was like in the deregulation of the phone industry, they did allow for large providers to actually provide the service, but then required them to provide access to competitors. You see the same thing in residential electricity. So there's one power supply in a geographic area, but they're required to allow competitors to actually use their capacity to sell competing service, even though it's basically the same thing. It's commoditized. Maybe that wasn't what you were asking, Toby, but that's how I interpreted your question.
Yeah, I mean, that would be sort of one potential answer, right? Sort of closer to the model of utility regulation, that you mandate some access, and several people are now thinking about proposing that for the big platforms. But yeah, I'm just curious. I've been thinking about this question, and you've been thinking about it. So I was just curious whether you have any good ideas. And it's not just the ability to comply with regulation. I mean, Google has its own ecosystem, its own browser. In some sense, it's not even that dependent on getting access to first parties, right? So.
Yeah, so I'm also like on the WC3 committee that's talking about what a world looks like without cookies. And there's dueling proposals. One where Google will keep all this information within the browser, which stops private information from leaking from the browser and potentially causing privacy problems. But one of their proposals is essentially for the browser to host the ad exchange and the auctioning of these web impressions. But then you might say, well, wait a minute, like now we're going to make Google in charge of every single one of these transactions. And so there's a second proposal from Criteo that says, no, wait a minute, we're not going to have everything going to go through Google. We're going to have everything go through this trusted third party. But then, this kind of goes back to both your question, where do we get this trusted third party from? And how do we force the market towards that trusted third party? So it's a mess, but we're seeing what your guys are asking about being wrestled with in real time, and now with these proposals for the death of the cookie. Any last questions? I really appreciate the discussion. This has been really fun and some really great questions.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks, thanks everyone for joining us as panelists, and also for those of you who jumped in at the end. Really interesting, and it's also great having you, Sam, as a co-author on the line for when we had some commercial breaks.
Oh God.
Thanks a lot, Garrett. This was great.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, guys.
And thanks for the